In this module, we'll cover image editing software. I'll show you how to install Photoshop in Play on Linux, as well as a free alternative to Photoshop called GIMP, which can be obtained from the Ubuntu Software Center. Now, I showed you how to install Play on Linux in a previous module, so I'll assume that you already have Play on Linux installed in Ubuntu Desktop. If you don't, it's available in the Ubuntu Software Center for free download. Now we're going to be installing Photoshop 7. If you've been following Photoshop or you use Photoshop, then you know that everything's moving to the cloud with what Adobe's doing with their new Creative Cloud software. Well, I bought a version of Photoshop 7 many years ago. It was about $500 or $600 at the time, and I've definitely gotten my money's worth out of it. It still runs on Windows 7 and in Windows 8. Even in Windows 10, the program still works perfectly, and so I personally still use it. Now, we can install a non-listed program here on Play on Linux, and that's exactly what I'm going to be doing, as again, I have my old Adobe Photoshop 7 CD-ROM that I purchased so many years ago. We'll simply click on Install, and then down here at the bottom, Install a non-listed program. This will bring up a dialog box for a manual installation. We'll hit Next. And we want to go ahead and install this program into a new virtual drive. Next, we'll put in the name of our program, which in this case is Photoshop 7.0. And the virtual drive we'll simply call Photoshop. Now, what would you like to do before installation? These are just options, so we don't have to select anything here. We don't need to use a special version of Wine or configure it or install any libraries for Photoshop 7. So we'll say next. This is a 32-bit program. It's an old program, so we want to make sure that we select that correctly. Now Wine is going to start up, and then Play on Linux is going to ask us for our installer file. That is our executable setup program. Here we found our CD-ROM with Photoshop, and that's how we want to install it. We'll hit Next, and you can see here that it encountered some sort of error reading from the CD. Now don't worry about this, okay? Because we can fix this. So here's what we're going to do. This happens with some programs. Again, I've told you not to expect Play on Linux to work out of the box. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to cancel out of this installation. We're going to minimize Play on Linux, and we're going to open up the CD-ROM drive itself. Now what we're going to do is create a new folder on the desktop that's called Photoshop. We're going to take all of the contents of a CD-ROM, and you can do this with any application that's not installing properly off of a CD-ROM. Sometimes it just doesn't know how to read the CD-ROM, and so you can download these files. You can pull these files off of the CD-ROM, put them into a place on the virtual disk, and then we can select the file for installation and Play on Linux. Now our files are done copying, and by the way, I didn't know that I was going to receive that error in Play on Linux. You've just sometimes got to run with whatever the application throws you, but I have encountered other similar errors. And I know that sometimes Play on Linux has difficulty installing directly off a CD, especially an older CD, if it's not structured in a way that it's expecting. You can also have read errors with your optical drive, difficulties through VirtualBox. But I think the biggest thing that's getting us as we close this CD and open our new Photoshop folder on the desktop is that Play on Linux probably didn't know where the setup file was actually located. Now, this disk has an autoplay.exe application. However, we're going to bypass that and go straight into the Photoshop directory and then install setup.exe. So when we move back to Play on Linux, we're going to go back to install a non-listed program. We're going to have to go through this process again. New virtual drive. The name is going to be Photoshop 7. And the virtual drive can be Photoshop as we specified before. None of these need to be checked. Select Next and make sure 32-bit Windows installation is selected if in fact you have an older program like this that is going to be a 32-bit. I'd already created the drive, so we're going to say go ahead and override it. That should be just fine. And now instead of selecting the CD-ROM, let's select another file. Here we can browse for the installer. We'll go to the desktop, then Photoshop, and then Photoshop again, and setup.exe. We're going to open that and select Next, cross our fingers. Here we go, Adobe Photoshop 7 in Ubuntu through Play on Linux. We will select Next. To avoid restarting your system, please close all Adobe applications before proceeding. I don't think we'll have a problem with that. We don't have any of that installed. US English, selecting my language. You can see how old this installer is, by the way. This is an old version of Photoshop. We'll accept all of that, and I'll put in my information here and proceed to the next screen. So I've gone ahead and put in my information, including my genuine serial number there. And remember, we don't need to change the installation path here, so all of that is fine. A typical installation will work for us. Here, I don't personally need to switch over any of these particular associations with these file types. I'm just going to leave it here on the default and hit Next, and Next again, and our installation will begin. It seems that our installation is complete. We don't need to display the Photoshop README file, so I will select Finish, and we'll close out the installer. Now Play on Linux is going to finish up here, and you can see that it's asking us to make a file for a shortcut. And so Photoshop.exe, there it is at the very bottom. We'll hit Next. Photoshop will be the name for our shortcut. No problem there. We've selected Next. Everything should wrap up. We should see Photoshop displayed here as well as a desktop shortcut to our new program, Photoshop 7. So here we have Photoshop in Play on Linux. And we also have a Photoshop icon here on our desktop. It just seems so weird to me being able to see that Photoshop icon displayed perfectly in Ubuntu. We can double click it and you can see that there's a little bit off there with the splash screen. No worries, that's just cosmetic. I do not want to register, so don't display this again. I've had this software so long, I think I've registered it like 18 times. Color settings will be configured using default settings. That's fine. Oh no, it's asking me if I want to configure it. No, I don't want to do that right now. And you can see that Photoshop is up and running, guys. I have Photoshop running in Ubuntu Desktop. But what if you don't have a copy of Photoshop? What if you don't want to use Photoshop? What is a good native program? Well, I've already mentioned it. You can use GIMP. Moving to the Ubuntu Software Center, we can download and install GIMP, a native open source program, which I think is very good. It's different from Photoshop, of course. Just type in GIMP there. And GIMP stands for the GNU Image Manipulation Program. And so we can just click on the install button here to install GIMP, and I'll show you around just for a little bit so you can get the basics of how that program works. And immediately you'll be able to see the differences between GIMP and a Photoshop style environment. Our new program is installed and ready to use. Let's open up GIMP. And again, I'll show you the differences between this program and Photoshop. First of all, you can see the similarities. This program is going to give you different panes that you can move around however you see fit. Remember that Alt shortcut trick that I taught you? Did you see how when it opened, the very top bar was off the screen? So I couldn't move it, but using that simple shortcut, holding down Alt, I was able to grab it to move this toolbar down. And I can do the same here because that top bar is off the screen. So this is similar to Photoshop in that it's going to open up these panes which you can move around. As with older versions of Photoshop, there's no backdrop pane or anything like that, so that can throw you off a little bit. But you do have your file menu up here at the top where you can open different images. One thing that throws some people off in GIMP is that when you go to save, that's only going to be saving a GIMP file. If you want to export a JPEG, a PNG, anything like that, then you can use the export option here. And GIMP is just a really handy tool. Again, a free alternative to Photoshop that you can certainly get used to and still make very professional additions, changes, and edits, as it were, to whatever image files you need to.